Everyone. My name is Andrew Jack from the Financial Times, the Global Education Editor, and it's a great pleasure to moderate this panel over the next 45 minutes or so in the Why You Should Care webinar series, co-hosted by the Financial Times and We're All Human. And we're going to talk this afternoon with a great panel and hopefully to hear from you all who are listening and watching on this session called Preparing the Next Generation for Inclusive Support Mechanisms, Creating the Pace. And we want to hear from this next generation of leaders about inclusive support to ensure that youth can continue to amplify their efforts collectively and individually to restore the planet and to protect life. So with us today, we have Javiers Journey, Press and Communications Analyst with the British Embassy in Mexico, Javiers, Program Management at SY Partners, Javier Aguirre, co-founder of Tempoc, Maggie Kervick, who's AVP of Sustainability and CSR at Keels since 1851, and we hope shortly Pedro Espinosa, the CEO of Pan Peru in the USA. And a reminder for those who are watching, we're very keen also to hear your perspectives and questions for the panel. So do please from now on use the Q&A function here if you'd like to share your views, and I'll try to bring those into the conversation in the second half or so in particular of our discussion. But let's begin perhaps by hearing a little bit from our panelists and a little about their own organization and personal journey and reflections on this theme. So should we start with Maggie? Hear a little bit from you, please.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you, Andrew, for leading this discussion today. I'm delighted to be with everybody. My name's Maggie. I lead sustainability for Kiehl's, a global skincare brand started in 1851. I feel very passionate about this topic in particular. I have my journey really started as a small business owner, really designing handbags. And I think as we think about what is access for youth or the youth having a seat at the table, I'm somebody who really benefited from the mentorship of others in building my career in this space. So I was trained really classically as an accessory designer, and sort of through a unique set of circumstances and a capsule collection, capsule collection of handbags I had. I got a unique opportunity to pitch Kenneth Cole, the fashion designer. Kenneth at that time was the chairman of AMFAR, the largest HIV/AIDS research organization. And had done a lot around women's reproductive health issues. And through sort of a funny conversation, he took a chance on me. And really not only did it start and stop there, but 6 months into my role there designing footwear, he really had identified a passion of mine that I hadn't identified, which was really how could business be used as a force for good? How could we look at new business models that delivered on not only business and financial results, but also on the delivery of environmental and social impacts? And so I'm somebody who started their journey thinking I was going to design handbags my whole life. And because of mentorship and folks like Kenneth stepping in and mentoring me, my career was redirected, and I now get to combine these passions that I hadn't even identified myself in those cross section of, right, how can business really drive sustainability at scale? So delighted to be here today and to talk more about some of the opportunities to get youth voices at the table. Oh, Andrew, I think
Sorry,
you're
excuse me. Sorry, let's hear a little bit from you, Javier, then about how you came to this, your situation.
Yes, first of all, thank you so much for moderating this panel, and for everyone that's tuning in. I'm delighted to be here. So I'm currently a program manager at SY Partners, which is a strategy and design consultancy that drives human-led transformations for some of the world's most influential organizations, including engagements with Fortune 50 executive leadership teams. And really how I've landed here essentially was I also had this really incredible opportunity actually when I was in my undergrad, where I was able to be a part of a leadership development program and actually be a part of a lot of experiential learning moments that really made me start to reflect for myself, what does it mean to be a leader, and how am I able to have a seat at this table in a way that is also sharing my point of view, and also just learning on the job, and trying to also really try to amplify more of the soft skills and push those edges in addition to the hard skills. And so really then from there, my career after graduating from NYU was really actually trying to work with executive leaders. So whether that was in the executive suite, working with, chief human resource officers, or also then from there going from Time Inc., or working with the vice chancellor of NYU Global Programs and University Life, where we're managing a global portfolio of 13 locations across the world. I really had this ability to look inside in at what was happening really in the boardroom level, and also just at the executive level in terms of conversations, decisions. And that really just influenced me in thinking about how are we then being able to engage with senior leaders, but then also bring in that youth perspective, and also how we can begin to embed sustainability and social impact a part of really businesses, and thinking also in the education sense, but also in the for-profit sense, and really looking at sustainable value versus stakeholder value. And so I'm continuing this journey and really working with visionary leaders and really trying to partner with them, and also with that youth lens, understanding how we can begin to bridge these gaps more effectively.
Thanks very much. Adali, let's hear from you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you everyone for being here. It's an honor to be part of this amazing panel this morning. My name is Allyship. I work currently for the Mexican Embassy, for the British Embassy in Mexico City. I can speak for myself from the public sector. I don't have experience in the private one, but what I can say is that I'm a woman, young professional who has been working in diverse government entities, such as the American government, the Mexican government, and now the British government. I'm very, very focused on diplomacy. And my career pretty much started with wanting to work like any other internationalist working in the UN. And looking to be there. And that's what brought me back in 2017 to be a youth delegate for Mexico at the United Nations, working very closely with the UN, with the Mexican UN mission, where I was looking closely into issues of indigenous communities, women and girls. And that's where I sort of realized the passion that I had for gender equality and for empowering women and girls. I personally never saw myself much of a leader, because I was, we kind of see leaders as people who can give great speeches and sitting in front of a crowd of 1,000 people, just show a lot of confidence. And for so long, I thought, well, I'm not precisely that kind of person who loves to speak in public. But what I did realize that I was very good at, and thanks to my mentors, I realized that I'm good at inspiring other people based on my experience. Being a young woman from Mexico and realizing that diplomacy is often seen as a field led by men, or that only men can succeed, that was in the beginning very disheartening for me. But then I realized that meeting other women diplomats who inspired me and let me know that age should not be an issue for a woman to seek a career, nor should it be social status, nor should it be the education that you receive, kind of made me want to find a career where I could also tell other women and girls, especially who want to be diplomats or who want to work in international affairs like I do, to let them know that it is possible to be part of this field, that they should not be discouraged by current dynamics of power or even gender dynamics that can often let them know that they shouldn't be holding a position or having a job because of their gender. So I think that inclusion must involve gender when we talk about promoting new or helping emerging and new leaders become the best version of themselves. So I really do think that to tackle discrimination and to tackle gender inequality, we need to think of inclusion as in a broader sense, and not just how do we support them economically or even socially.
So I'm definitely going to come back to the dynamics of power that you talk about in a second, but let me just bring in Javier to introduce himself and his initial reflections, please.
Sure, of course. Well, again, very grateful to be learning from you all and getting a chance to share a little bit and have this conversation. I won't talk too much about my past history. I'm an entrepreneur. I've been working for the last 15 years on trying to build technology products, business models that show that there's an alternative way of doing things and that are more humane and that keep, the people who end up using it and the environment in mind, and that across a very wide, diverse series of industries. But but perhaps in line with our conversation, I had the fortune or misfortune that I fell into this journey or entrepreneurship adventure when I was too young, when I was 15, and that, of course, was thanks to people that trusted me, that despite having a young face and still going to school and whatnot, trusted what we were building, not only me, but the team of people and also the team of people I decided to join you are placing a lot of trust, right? I didn't get that much mentorship, honestly, throughout my career for a number of reasons, different environments, some of them very complicated. My family side, lots of support, but they were not from the business world. So not much mentorship from the professional side on that end. But what I found and was critical for me was allyship. And being able to find, when I was 19, a couple communities of people of my age, one of them being Global Shapers, another one called Sandbox, but basically people that were crazy enough to be doing different things, not only as an entrepreneur, but also artists or lawyers or whatnot. That was critical. Just seeing people my age that were just thinking a bit differently, and being from Spain, trust me, that was like a breath of fresh air. That was actually what made the big difference. If it was not for that, I would not have been able to survive, which I think is the right word, survive the journey of trying to do things differently from the what is expected out of you and the status quo. So I think that's an important thing, and I don't think in many ways the education system in many countries and the way we're raised encourages us to find allyship in people our age. People are pushed to find a boss, find a mentor that teaches you, and that's great. But sometimes it's in your peers and the people around you, your age, that you can find actually great support, especially from the psychological side of things.
And that's a great point. I mean, just flesh that out a little bit. What you would see as the different characteristics, perhaps, of allyship, or maybe how allyship could lead through support to a sort of mentorship that at least kind of helps nurture and support you.
Yeah, of course. I think there's one thing. I'll throw a wild card here into the conversation. I think an enemy of allyship is leadership. I think when you name someone in the room to be the leader and you say this person is a leader, the rest of the people in the room feel they don't have to do the work anymore because the leader is in charge. And I feel when you shift the conversation from who is leading or not to actually what is the work that has to be done, why does this matter, why are we doing this, what's the problem that needs to be fixed, then those dynamics of power change a little bit, and it's more about, okay, how we can team up to do things together. So I think that's an element that in that reframing helps a little bit, but it's very abstract. And also I think it's very culturally different. I'd love to hear from Heria, Maggie, and Natalie, what does allyship mean in your own cultures? Because it's probably different in the US or in Europe or whatnot, and how maybe some of your peers relate to this topic.
Yeah, so who'd like to come back on that question of allyship and its importance for you? Adeline, maybe?
That's a very interesting thought that you give, Javier. And I was actually, when I initially said in my intervention that I didn't particularly see myself as a leader, was precisely because of what you mentioned. That my perception of a leader many years ago was seeing someone making the decisions and kind of giving tasks to others, when in reality, that's not being a leader, that's being a boss, right? So what I do think that allyship, and at least what I've seen in Mexico and in the public sector, it can be a two-sided part. On one side, it can be this facade of, oh, we support one another and we want to grow horizontally, and it's all about us being the best. But in reality, what I've seen also is that many times that facade is really a facade. Really, it's really not about really supporting people on the inside. And I think going back to the issue of gender, I think that to be aware of how inequalities work or how they can, be part of this dynamic of power is that we cannot see inequalities if we don't look back, or at least look at the people who have suffered them the most. I'm talking about women, girls, indigenous peoples, and other groups that are maybe not regarded as valuable for the rest of the world because they don't give the same, I guess, output, or they don't give the same results as someone who is fully capable to manage a business or a team or whatever. So I think we have a responsibility in allyship to really empower people, and not just to be leaders and say, oh, this is my team and I'm very proud of them, but actually saying, this is my team and I want to empower them, to making them part in the decision process, maybe not at the same level as a leader or a main decision taker has, but being part of the process is already a very good tool to make people feel included and to keep growing, making them feel that they're included and help them be part of their personal and professional growth.
Hadia, what's your take on this allyship and the whole idea of inclusive support mechanisms more generally that you found really valuable?
Yeah, I mean, I heard this word come up, and this was the word empowerment. And I think that really is the key piece of allyship, is how we're able to actually come together to empower one another. And I think a part of allyship then is also recognizing that your peer has maybe a strength that you may not have. So I think sometimes when we think about leadership, that still doesn't mean necessarily that you have the entire skill set to be a holistic leader. It takes a group of individuals together to come to ultimately create something that is going to be meaningful. And Javi really mentioned this. It's at the end of the day, it's the work and how it gets done. But I think what's really important in allyship is that orchestration of that work. And that's when, everyone comes together with their different skill sets, their masteries, and they're really able to see one another for what someone has to bring. And so I know in my past experiences, I started in a nonprofit when I was in high school, and it was something honestly, I had no idea what I was doing. And I was in a role where I was a founder. But for me, it was a student-led organization. And so I was working with individuals who were also my peers. And I leaned into them for areas of that I did not have expertise in. And as a result, I think that organization was really able to be successful and impact other individuals in a sense that, we were distributing books to children in low access communities. And so as a result, it was really students giving for other students. And so to try to create this circular model where we're all in support of one another, where we're all really tapping into each other's areas of strengths, and also just having a little bit of humility. I think that's a big piece of allyship, is knowing that you don't know everything. And I would add to this, in addition, it's not just allyship, I also think it's pure mentorship. I learned so much from my peers. And so I think if we create more of a culture of learning versus a culture of competition, then I think ultimately then we're really all able to thrive. Then, as Javi said, survive.
Yeah, and Maggie, you talked at the start about some mentorship from senior levels. What about this sort of more peer-to-peer or allyship? How important has that been for you, do you think?
I think it's critically important. I think, so much of my experience was the very first fundamentals were mentorship and access, right? I had parents who were very encouraging of entrepreneurship. So similar to Hadia and Javi, started a company at a young age and was really protected and encouraged, if you will. But I think very quickly, as I started to enter into other organizations, I learned very quickly from those, leaders who had the decision-making and the power in sort of sometimes sitting down and just asking those very humble questions of how are you doing this all, right? Those trying to understand, what does balance even look like? I learned very quickly, we all have imposter syndrome. And even those who are in these places of power that seem to have all the answers, more often than not, behind the scenes are struggling and learning and trying to figure things out. And I've grown up in industries that are not necessarily known to be the most supportive industries. So thinking about beauty or even fashion. And I think one of the things that has been critical for me as well was early on finding a community of young people that had these like-minded passions and targets, and the ability to harness that energy to really propel my own thinking even forward, and really change the way I showed up and thought about these complex problems and how do we solve some of them. And I come from these industries that are known, right? There's Devil Wears Prada is the bet, right? That movie was made for a reason. But I think what we're seeing and what this next generation coming up really sees and identifies is we have something like 2,500 days left before we push the planet's boundaries, push past a point and into a place where we're going to be in an irreversible situation. So now that we, up against that landscape, the more people we bring into the conversation, the better. So the idea of this top-down leadership or finger wagging, I don't think is going to cut it. It's how are we building bridges amongst our peers, up, down, right, sideways, with the people that we work with, and how do we have a conversation that allows people to not only enter the dialogue, but also relate. I think so much of all the work that everybody here on the phone is doing is trying to tackle some of these most complex issues. So how can we best meet? I think so much of what many of us who know each other on the line have gotten to do is understand and learn from each other tips and tricks, if you will, of breaking through the noise and helping sometimes those in power understand and connect to issues, right? Maybe if I'm Hedy and I'm talking to a CEO or a CFO, right, I'm going to talk to them about the business case. Whereas if I'm talking to the CHRO, I may be going to have more of a conversation about employee retention or engagement or career pathways. So I think so much of what allyship allows us is this supportive environment to be vulnerable and say, how have you done this? And also get a little bit of that shared, my dad likes to call it the fire in the belly, right? So harness each other's passion to sort of propel us all forward.
And do you think, in your experience, has it been, where there have been barriers, have they been more gender related or sort of age related, do you think?
So I can't speak from experience because I'm one of the lucky people that really hasn't encountered severe barriers or even discrimination from a gender perspective or an age perspective. So I'm probably not the best one to answer that, but I think probably what has enabled me to stay a part of these conversations and so much of before coming to Kiehl's, I was part of a team that built the fashion industry's only CEO working group, driving collective action on sustainability with 47 CEOs. They represent about 260 brands, 400 billion in annual revenue. They were coming to the table, not really knowing if they were going to stay together. But I think they didn't know what the UN Sustainable Development Goals were, right? Those were just being introduced. You had I guess it was COP21 at that point, probably, where everybody making these big carbon announcements. And you had a room full of leaders saying, like, do I have carbon? Where is it? So how do we, I think so much of what I learned from that experience was how do we make these very complex issues that we're all super passionate about digestible and able to meet people where they are or where they have the influence to make change. I'll give a perfect example. When I was in my role at Kenneth Cole, classically trained as an accessory designer, but now in a role where I had NGOs coming and doing a little bit of the finger wagging and asking me questions about carbon emissions or protecting farmer livelihoods. But so much of those things, it's like we have to walk towards each other on the bridge, right? Science and NGOs kind of play golf, long walking strategic game. You have business playing American football quarter after quarter, having to deliver results. So it's sometimes hard to see how we translate these issues into business practices. But if everybody's willing to walk on that bridge and see where is the point that we can interact and take action, I think you start to see, I think different than maybe 10 years ago, I find less and less the need to convince people to care and more about how to make it concrete and actionable for them. So that would be my experience. But I'd love to hear what some of my peers think.
Yeah, and Adeli, you touched on this earlier. I mean, obviously, sometimes even parts of the public sector and the international organizations can be quite hierarchical, can't they? How much, how would you compare the sort of the gender versus the age or the hierarchical barriers for you and some of your peers?
It's very true. I was listening to my colleagues speak, and I was thinking, well, I wish I had been that lucky, right? Because it's not just me, but I've seen it really in my field, that women usually feel very disheartened when they look for other positions. Even in my case, I remember when I was younger, a few years ago, looking for positions online and trying to get a job, and I would say, I would see that they would ask for 8 years experience, but I would look at the rest of the qualifications and say, hey, this is my profile. I could perfectly do this job, but I don't need 8 years of experience because I would be still in college if I had to apply to that job, right? So I do think that it's very unfortunate how this age part can be especially affected to women. I mean, I saw a study somewhere a long time ago saying that when a position that asks for a certain number of years is published, men are most likely to apply to that job despite not meeting all the requirements, whereas a woman won't, because they will feel like they're not confident enough, whereas men do. So I think that's also part of the problem, how we need to empower more women to feel confident in their specific fields, regardless whether it's public or private sector. I remember that I was mentoring a young girl from my university after I had graduated from school, and she was telling me how scared she was to look for a job and how she wanted to take into the same program that I had done in the UN or look for a master's degree. And I would ask her, but why don't you do this? What's stopping you? And she would say, well, because I saw these other male colleagues who did that and he had a better GPA than I did, so he's gonna get it if I don't. And I said, well, but you have all these other skill sets. You did internships here and there, you volunteer, you do all this and that. So, and that ultimately, I don't know if she actually got the job that she wanted or not, but those are the kinds of thoughts, intrusive thoughts that make women and young professionals like me feel discouraged, right? So, I mean, I'm very fortunate to work in an organization right now where equality, and there's actually more women than men working in my job, so I'm very glad of that. But I would love to see in the future more organizations be gender neutral. I know that some companies, what they do now is that when they send out applications or receive applications for jobs, they don't receive them with the gender of the person who's applying, which provides something more neutral and a fairer ground for everyone. So I just hope that's the kind of practice that we continue to promote both in the public and the private sector.
And there's only one other group, and you mentioned from some of your past activities, some of those from the marginalized communities. How much still greater a challenge is that, and what can be done to try to bring them in?
That's even a harder one, because when I talk about other groups, such as Indigenous communities, or people who are under the spectrum or have mental health issues, I cannot personally speak for them because it's not my voice, the one that should be heard, it should be their voices. So I think that us in the positions that we have, having these kinds of platforms, we should be able to allow these people to have these spaces to speak out and talk about their issues and talk about their needs and talk about how they can receive help from us. I remember that I used to work in a volunteering group with Indigenous communities, and we met this young girl from the south of Mexico. It's in a state called Oaxaca, and she was part of a group of Indigenous peoples who were a part of. They had actually an environmental group that wanted to go to COP26 last year, but they were unsure of how to reach government entities who could sponsor them, or let alone listen to them, because they would not be listened to. So I thought, how do we create a space that will allow them to speak out and gain notoriety from the media, from, I guess, the public in general? So I think my job as someone who is privileged, because I'm not from that group, it will be very wrong for me to try to speak on their behalf. It should be me leaving them the space to say what they need to. And from my privilege, help them reach their goals and objectives to the extent that it's possible for me. And that's something that I try to do right now, and that I will definitely keep looking forward to do once I keep growing in my career and go to grad school and go to other areas professionally.
And Javier, I'm curious, different sectors, I mean, for example, in the startup space, perhaps there's maybe a little bit less hierarchy than you might see, and therefore maybe a little bit less of an age-related set of barriers. Although, of course, in tech, for example, you very often have a gender bias, at least, don't you? At least, what's your reflection about the differences and the nuances, perhaps, in the organizations you're involved with?
Yeah, I think in the case, and startups is it's just the size of organization at the end of the day. But in general, if there's a common thing among all of these organizations, that they move very fast. They move much faster than their peers, and that may mask a little bit of the actual politics that happen in these organizations, because they exist and they're brutal, because the economic incentives are bigger and the risks are bigger. So and in that case, I would say gender definitely plays a huge role, but there are other ones that are a bit more hidden. And I learned recently from a colleague, for example, that is Indian, about the caste system. Obviously, the caste system in India, but I don't know about the caste system in Silicon Valley, and how if you are Indian, they will know typically by your last name of where you're coming from. Even though there's like thousands of years of history, your family has nothing to do with that. You may be living in the US for 2-3 generations, but you would have less prospects if you are from a lower caste. And most of the CEOs and people in higher positions in large corporations and startups in Silicon Valley of that origin, you see, and it exists. But you can take that example. You can take example of going to Stanford or an Ivy League university. There are many layers, and I feel that we fall into the temptation of seeing these fast-paced organizations, these innovative organizations, as doing things better. But I think that precisely because they move faster, many times we tend to forgive them for oversights that they commit. So I don't know. At the end of the day, one of the ways I feel we could approach this is with education, and some of these things can be trained. And they can be trained in universities and other education institutions, but also in the workplace. And skills like, for example, negotiations, those are vital, and it's very rare. I mean, you may study public policy and you get a good negotiations professor or business school, but that's it. As an engineer, no one taught me that till I did my master's. So things like that can actually break those barriers and help people, take, as Ali was mentioning, like take that job that, you may feel not compelled to apply because you just don't feel confident, and things like that. You can have a little boost. Oh, we have Pedro here.
Oh, Pedro, yes, welcome.
Nice.
Sorry to hear about your challenges, but great you managed to join us. Just very briefly, perhaps, and just to bring up to speed, but we've been talking about the barriers, particularly for young people, including sort of gender and age and hierarchy and so on. But also the importance, as Javier was saying earlier, about there's mentorship and there's also allyship. I wonder if you wanted to just say a word a little about your background and what your reflections might be on how we encourage a nurturing environment for younger people to progress and to be able to express leadership skills.
Thank you, Andrew. I think the key part of mentorship is bilateral mentorship. Many times the younger generations or millennials or Gen Zs or others, we tend to expect things super fast, but it takes time to foster and build that trust and that mutual respect and trust. Just to give you an example, after meeting my first angel investor for my software company, my startup here in San Francisco, it took me 3 years, to foster that friendship, and then he wrote the first check. So you don't need a title to be a leader, and you can also help others, right? Like not necessarily with money, but like if we want to promote the next generation of leaders, we need to seek how can we serve the mentors as well. And that's like bilateral mentorship, Andrew. And I've seen it many times where CEOs or executives learn from their interns or next gen leaders when it comes to like technology tools, when it comes to travel hacks and different things. We tend to be savvier in those things. So yeah, bilateral mentorship is key.
Sure. We've had a couple of comments and questions from people who are watching this seminar. Just read out this one here. a participant saying being a leader can come at all sorts of different levels. A receptionist can be a leader, for example, as a gatekeeper of a team. And the dynamics of leadership versus management are very different. Mentorship has no titles. Mentoring is based on experiences. And let's not forget also the power of reverse mentorship. So some interesting thoughts there. And a question that follows on from that, from a participant here, from an organizational standpoint, how can we support and provide better mentorships for youth? Hadia, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that really also starts with first developing a space for open dialogue and a culture that is inclusive. So I think first being able to create an organization where they're able to acknowledge that it's what their culture is like, being human-centric, and then ultimately developing programs and initiatives. I want to start off that in addition to mentorship, I think something that also is really key in creating an inclusive culture that can foster mentorship is also really being able to create a culture of learning. And so that it's not just, I think that folks on this call have mentioned it, and it was mentioned also in this chat that there's also reverse mentorship. So where there are areas that individuals are going to have able access both to whether it's leaders in the organization and vice versa. So I think that is being able to match those together, create those pairings, create teams where you're going to see a more diverse group of individuals working together, that they're able to have those forms of conversations, that they're being facilitated. And I also think it's really going to be important to, in addition to creating roles that are actually more purpose-driven, and then being able to have younger individuals being hopefully hired into these roles, that it's not based on experience. And as a result, then, if you're able to create that youth pipeline, I think that is actually a key initiative to then ultimately being able to foster open dialogue and conversations where one can exchange learnings. And that really starts with actually creating a culture of learning that's going to unlock, I want to say, natural mentorship that can flow within the organization.
Sure. Anyone else like to come in on ideas about how organizations can support and provide better mentors for younger people?
I can jump in. I go back to, right, this idea of access, and right, I very much so feel incredibly lucky and one of the fortunate ones that right, starting with parents and then through folks along the journey, really had the support to see like what could be possible, right? We're all limited by what we have exposure to, especially at a young age. And I think how do we give voice and ownership to those that have stake in the solutions ultimately that we're trying to design, right? They become, right, more by having the right kind of people at the table and diverse voices at the table, we can actually have enough perspective to then tackle some of these complex issues. But one of the things I think is a big, it's a personal thing for me when we think about organizations, and especially large ones, and how do you create the right space for youth voices. I think first and foremost, we can't ignore the fact that things like interning is a privilege, right? So many of the internship opportunities are unpaid, right? College credit. I'm somebody who was lucky enough to be able to intern throughout my college career, but many of my peers, right, had to work. So right off the bat, right, if we need years of experience just to get an entry-level job, we're already eliminating people right off the bat by not paying people and not having the right incentives in place to get people and more diverse voices into the workforce to begin with. So that's a big one for me. And then I think it's the other thing I always think is important to look at is what are our internal policies and incentive structures, and is that supporting, right, more collaboration, or is it actually inhibiting? I worked for a consulting firm in my past, and as much as they did so much internal work to get everybody to collaborate, at the end of the day, the way your reporting structure was, you weren't actually that incentivized to really collaborate. So there's sometimes structures that are at odds, right? If the values of the company and the incentives aren't lined up, then it doesn't matter how much you want to talk about, right? Career pathways and creating pipeline of talent. You have to put your money where your mouth is. And I think it continues to be a big hurdle. And then the last piece of that I would just say, and I think this comes with, I don't want to ignore the fact that you need to have some degree of encouragement and confidence to be able to do this. But I think there is an opportunity, and Pedro touched on this a little bit, to ask people, right, for a coffee, be brave enough to ask people to hear about their journey. And I think most people are eager and happy to share their experience. And that's, for me personally, so much of the mentorship piece and the allyship, if I'm honest, started by that simple question of, hey, can I have a coffee with you? I'd love to hear your journey or your passions or where you came from. And now, even though I'm so glad to be on a panel about being a youth leader, I feel like very quickly we're aging out of that category. And as we step into these positions, I try to be incredibly intentional about asking the people that are in the end, right? The more junior folks on the team are really the ones in the weeds, and they are going to actually know the best and most effective ways to get things done process-wise versus their bosses who are too high level and don't know the day-to-day. So maybe their boss would recommend an approach to execute something, but really, because they're not in the weeds, they're just making everybody's lives that much harder. So I think there's so much opportunity to work with those, right? In this case, I'm using the example of within my own team, but we can, right, use the example across other, right, in other kind of contexts of how do you actually better partner with the folks that are going to ultimately be doing the work to make sure, and asking them, how should we get this done? Because I think the days of this top down, we know that it doesn't work, right? We know that as we look at the progression of so many of these complex issues facing both the environment and society, when the most effective solutions are when the most vulnerable populations, or those the most affected by whatever topic we're talking about, are at the table, right? It's not about me telling somebody how to best do something in a context that I maybe don't have any right experience or cultural understanding of. So those are like my little 2 cents, but I think there's a real hard look that organizations need to do about how they actually incentivize the values they're trying to see.
So that's a great segue. We're almost out of time, but just perhaps very briefly turning to the others. So we've talked about some of the structural barriers. We've talked about mentorship and allyship. Who else? Just briefly, almost in just a sentence each, perhaps. I'd love any other thoughts you have on what role and what mechanisms to foster leadership by young people within organizations. Adelaide, do you want to come back on that? Just really a sentence, please.
Yeah, just to, being very brief about that. I just think there needs to be also a lot of empathy and being very mindful of how we treat other people. Because I think that I've seen in a lot of organizations that when you remain so professional, it can always, you can sometimes even look like there's like no emotion, or there's like your peers don't really care about you. And I think that mindset do has to change for us to create a more diverse and more inclusive community, both in the public and private sector. Because if we don't care about others, it's less likely that you are going to incentivize others to perform better. I do think that we need to be willing to listen to others, really. And I think in my experience, like Maggie mentioned it really well, that mentorship also has to involve being able to be vulnerable. And I'm very grateful that my greater mentor that has ever helped me was someone who was willing to listen to me, who was willing to even see me cry during very hard moments of my life. And those are the times of people that I keep remembering, and that I think that person helped me in a very hard moment and also encouraged me to be a better professional. I want to be that kind of person for future mentees that I will have. So I do think that it's some food for thought that we need to treat others the way, like the golden rule, right? But yeah.
We're just as we're coming up to the end, there's more questions coming in. Let me just throw a couple out. Maybe I'll go through one to you, Javier. So what's something you would have liked to have known before heading into your workforce as a young person?
Oh my God, that's that's not, there's so many things. But I would say one of them is that normally opportunities are not that obvious and things come in the most unexpected ways. And precisely because of that, and maybe tying with the last question, providing your young employees with exposure, like make them do things, expose them to other people, allow them to shadow maybe other departments, other people. Not those are the ways things come. And I would say something I didn't know is that serendipity plays a big role. But in order for serendipity to work, you need to be able to expose yourself to different things. And definitely, if you're joining the workforce as an intern with not many tasks or not very well paid or not very, very boxed in a certain place, it's very hard for serendipity to happen. But for many people, that's where, they discover their passion and they grow as professionals later on. So I'll say that's one.
Okay, and Hadia, you've got the final word. What would your advice be? What would you have liked to have known? What advice would you give to others starting off?
The trap of perfectionism. I think that there is so much pressure that is prioritizing performance over passion. And as a result, especially at a young age, we're rooted in a lot of fear or judgment or disapproval from others. So there's this constant need to prove yourself. And it can ultimately lead to burnout. And I also think as a result of that, which I think is, we think about mental health right now, which is increasingly issues are on the rise, especially with Gen Z. And I think that if we're able to alleviate this idea that we always have to be perfect, and I say that to myself, I am struggling day by day, and I set my own expectations for myself above and beyond, but also really recognizing that failure is a learning curve. And at the end of the day, we are constantly learning as individuals. And I think if we're able to actually embrace failure and see it as learning, and being able to be a little bit more kinder to ourselves, and ultimately to actually encourage organizations to be more kinder, and Adiela said it very well, empathy. And I think that it can actually hopefully help us thrive so that we're able to actually empower more action from a place that is also sustainable for our own well-being, to ultimately create a sustainable world.
Well, great. Look, I mean, perfect summing up. I'm afraid we're out of time. But yes, so I hear empathy, empowerment, humility, inclusivity, the need for a continuing culture of learning and thinking about mentorship, but also allyship. And above all, as you say, kind of keeping hold of and nurturing passion as being really important. So thank you for those remarks. Thank you to all of you for your great comments. Thanks everyone for watching, and best of luck in your keeping the flame burning, and as you develop in your careers and your leadership roles. Best of luck, and thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. Such a treat.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Yes.
Yeah.